Hello, I'm Marion Fulker and I'm the CEO of Perth's leading think tank, the Committee for Perth. Welcome to Fact-Based Talks, an online series where you get to hear the latest research from our organisation. Fact-Based is a long-standing joint venture research program between the Committee for Perth and the University of Western Australia. We are the leaders in delivering tangible research that drives structural, cultural and behaviour change on issues that matter to the people of Greater Perth. To date, the partnership has produced more than 80 pieces of research, creating a knowledge base on issues that affect our region and its future. These include the economy, global competitiveness, transport and mobility, gender equality, and the region's demography and geography, to name but a few. Each of these is available on our website for download free of charge. This current series of fact-based talks is the opportunity to share incremental research on our Future of Work project, which aims to equip WA and its people for the changing world of work. I trust you find the information and analysis contained in this presentation stimulating and that it adds to your understanding of a complex issue that affects us all.
So this is the third fact-based bulletin prepared as part of the Future of Work project, and it looks at the shifting demographics of Western Australia's labour force. And I just thought I'd provide some background first up. Fact-based research provides a baseline understanding of Greater Perth and WA, and this is in essence about looking backwards in order to understand past trends and quantifying current conditions in order to understand how the region and the state could transform in the future. The Committee for Perth's current Future of Work project incorporates multiple streams of work, and this fact-based bulletin is one of the initial pieces. It follows fact-bases 70 and 71, which examined literature and statistics around the future of work and jobs in the state. The papers provided evidence which indicates that work and workforce changes as a result of technology are not new. Change has been occurring, and at times rapid change, since the first industrial revolution. The bulletins also found that changes in technologies have resulted in some jobs being displaced, but also the creation of new jobs. And often these new jobs are high skill and high value jobs. For example, many jobs in the scientific and technology sector just didn't exist 10 to 20 years ago. Technology has also made many industries safer than ever before, and this has vastly increased efficiency and per capita productivity in some sectors. Where employee numbers have decreased, but output has increased over time, and manufacturing is an example. In WA and Greater Perth, we've seen a shift over the past 5 decades in the types of jobs people work in. Back in the mid-20th century, jobs in Perth were primarily in manufacturing, administration and clerical roles, supporting Perth's role as an agricultural and governance centre. Today, jobs are focused in service sectors such as retail, health, education and professional services, and in major non-service sectors, including construction and mining. Jobs in some sectors like retail are declining in response to global and technological trends, while jobs in other sectors like health science are increasing. And this is referred to as structural change in the economy. And in WA, like in the rest of Australia, there has been a shift away from non-service sector employment and towards service sector employment over time. However, structural change in WA has not been as rapid or as significant as in other states in Australia. And this is due to significant growth in employment in the mining sector over the past 2 decades, which has driven growth in other associated sectors like construction and transport. Yet looking forward, these sectors have been identified as potentially susceptible to the impacts of technological change, and these impacts are already evident in some businesses. So what's clear is that the skills needed in the workforce are changing. And it's projected that there'll be increased demand for skills associated with the service sector and skills that are required to support technological advancement in other sectors. Research indicates that the skills that are most needed will include non-routine, cognitive, creative, abstract and human skills, such as those associated with interaction and communication. So if we move to the first slide, literature tells us that workforce diversity is important to meeting future workforce needs, and it has significant benefits. And I just think it's really important to keep this in mind when we're talking about workforce demographics. A diversity of workers is important in order to ensure that there's an adequate supply of workers to meet industry needs. And diverse workplaces have been found to benefit from a broader range of skills and talents in the workplace, which have been shown to heighten innovation and create and drive productivity. Diverse companies benefit from a more flexible and adaptable workforce, heightened workforce morale, and an increased ability to attract talented workers, particularly in the global marketplace. Moving on to the next slide, data shows that increasing workforce diversity has been a key feature of workforce and workplace change since the middle of last century. There have been very significant changes in who participates in the workforce in WA, and alongside this have been significant changes in how people work. 3 key workforce demographic changes have been identified in WA. Firstly, growth in female labour force participation. Secondly, the ageing of the workforce. And thirdly, increasing cultural diversity. At the same time, there's been growth in part-time work and an associated decline in the full-time workforce. There's also been an increase in gig or contract work and growth in working from home and flexible workplace approaches. If we move to the next slide, looking at some of these trends in detail, this slide shows growth in female participation in the WA labour force since the 1970s. It illustrates 4 key features. The first is that female participation has grown from 46% in 1978 to 62.5% in 2020. The second is that female participation grew relatively rapidly in the 1980s and 90s, but stabilised from about 2005 onwards. The third feature is that male labour force participation has declined. And the fourth feature is that female labour force participation remains below that of men. Looking at the next slide, growth in female labour force participation has been driven by a number of core factors, which include heightened social acceptance of women remaining in the labour force, particularly after marriage and during child-rearing years. It's also been a direct result of the women's rights movement, federal and state legislative change, structural change in the economy, and a shift to flexible and part-time work, which is a feature of employment in many service sector industries such as healthcare. This has increased the capacity for many women to remain in the workforce while also juggling family and caring responsibilities. Moving to the next slide, despite heightened female participation, sectors of employment remain strongly gendered in WA. So if you refer to the graph on the right side of this slide, it shows that in Western Australia, sectors such as healthcare and social assistance and education and training are strongly female dominated, while sectors like agriculture, mining, manufacturing, transport and construction remain heavily masculine. One of the only sectors to achieve relative gender parity is public administration and safety, while sectors such as professional, scientific and technical services are less gendered than others. Looking at professional sectors in more detail, if we look at the graph on the left, it shows that the professional occupations that are least segregated include legal, social and welfare professions and business, human resource and marketing professions, so professions in the humanities. Looking to the next slide, the benefits of heightened female participation and gender integration in the future workforce are multiple, but there are significant challenges to increasing female participation in the labour force, and these are complex. They include the fact that industry sectors remain gendered, which limits perceived work possibilities for females and males. It also has been associated with continued underrepresentation of women in senior leadership roles, lower average remuneration for women compared to men, heightened caring responsibilities among women, and overrepresentation of some declining sectors, of women in some declining sectors, such as administrative and support services. The 2019 Australian Digital Inclusion Index also identified a digital divide, with older women reporting lower levels of adaptation to new technology than men, noting that there's no divide for younger women, or young women under 25, that is. There also remains a limited pipeline of women in science, technology, engineering and mathematics sectors, which are important industry sectors in WA and are expected to increase in importance in the future as industries innovate and adapt to new technology. Moving to the next slide, The feminisation of the workforce has been associated with an increase in part-time work, the share of which grew from 15% in 1978 to 31% in 2020. Growth in part-time and flexible work has also been linked to growth in the service sector employment, such as healthcare, which is associated with non-standard work hours and therefore heightened demand for flexible and part-time employees. Females are significantly more likely to work part-time than males. Yet, interestingly, the proportion of males in part-time roles is increasing. There's also been a shift towards gig or contract work over the past 2 decades, and this shift is primarily masculine, with 64% of gig and contract workers in WA being male. Moving to the next slide, the shift away from full-time work has been driven by factors of demand and supply. Supply factors include the population growth and decline, the feminisation and ageing of the workforce, while demand factors include economic downturns, changes to business operating hours, and changes in technology, reducing and shifting demand for workers. The ability for businesses to adapt to both shifts in demand and supply through flexible work arrangements have been enabled by labour market reforms, particularly in the 1980s and 90s. In the past, academic literature often really looked at the shift towards flexible work as a negative, as heightening the risk of underemployment and underutilisation in the economy. Yet more recent commentary recognises that there are benefits of flexible work arrangements for businesses and employees. These include enabling businesses to build a team of workers whose hours can be adjusted to meet economic cycles, to work non-standard hours, or even to work in remote locations. It can also save jobs. For example, recent research shows that businesses today are increasingly likely to adjust worker hours to respond to changing economic conditions rather than make staff redundant. This doesn't mean that underemployment, underutilisation, or even precarious work is not an issue, and it could become an increasing problem in the future. It's recently been estimated that about 25% of the part-time workforce have the capacity and would prefer to work additional hours. It's also noted that men working part-time are more likely to report underemployment than females. Moving to the next slide, in this context, it's noted that while growth in part-time work has been most apparent in female-dominated industries, it's also been increasing in male-dominated non-service industries, including mining, construction, and manufacturing. Currently, 16% of workers in construction and manufacturing work part-time. Moving to the next slide, growth in male and female part-time employment is shown in this graph, which illustrates the proportion of females working part-time, which sits at about 50%, while the proportion of males employed part-time has increased to close to 20%. The graph also suggests that part-time work tends to increase during periods of economic downturn, such as during the 1990s and late 2010s, and decrease during periods of economic growth. This trend suggests that increasing part-time and flexible work is like a trend likely to be retained at least into the short to medium term future, and that an increase in part-time and flexible employment could be a notable feature of the COVID-19 downturn. Statistics available to date indicate that growth in part-time work has been a feature of the downturn, with rates of unemployment among males and females highest among workers seeking full-time work. Moving to the next slide, the second major demographic change that has occurred in the workforce in WA is ageing. The ageing of the workforce reflects the ageing of the population, which is a global trend in developed nations. This slide compares the age profile of the workforce in 2000 and the age profile of the workforce in 2020. It shows a very significant growth in the proportion of workers aged over 50 years and a substantial decline in workers aged 29 years or younger. As a result, 31% of WA's workforce is currently aged over 60, and female part-time workers aged over 60 make up 16% of the workforce. Moving to the next slide, older workers who remain in the workforce are most often professionals, managers, and clerical office workers, rather than trades workers or labourers, although representation in those jobs is still relatively high. Professions with the highest proportion of workers aged over 60 are legal, social and welfare professions and education and health professions, making these sectors potentially more vulnerable to the impacts of ageing. Shifting to the next slide, in addition to the declining size of the workforce, the ability of the workforce to adapt to technology has been identified as another issue associated with ageing. In regard to technology, recent research in Australia shows that older workers are significantly less likely to work in technology sectors. It also shows that technology use and ability declines with age, with Australians aged over 50 reporting less technological capability than younger people. This divide is highest among females who are aged over 65 years. Moving on to the next slide, despite this, older workers are going to be important in order to retain skill, experience and talent in the workforce moving forward. Yet they are the group most likely to leave the workforce due to retirement. Downturns can accelerate retirement amongst some older workers, and recent statistics show that in WA, workers aged over 70 have exhibited the most significant decline in employment in WA since March this year. And this is thought to be linked to declining participation in this age group, with older workers choosing to opt out of the workforce in response to the impacts of COVID-19. Shifting to the next slide, the third trend I'll discuss in the WA workforce has been cultural diversification. In 2016, statistics show that WA had the highest proportion of workers born overseas of all the states. Notable difference in the cultural diversity of the workforce included lower proportions of workers born in Oceania, significantly higher proportions of workers from Northeastern Europe, and a slightly higher share from Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Committee for Perth Research has also shown that Greater Perth's workforce has become more diverse over the past 2 decades, particularly in response to periods of rapid economic growth associated with the mining boom. Shifting to the next slide, the data shows that overseas-born workers are more likely to be professionals than workers born in Oceania. This reflects policies for skilled migration, which aim to attract migrants into occupation where a shortage has been identified in the state. There's also a relatively high representation of overseas-born workers in low-skilled jobs in sectors like accommodation and food services. Industry sectors with the most diverse workforces include manufacturing, accommodation and food services, professional and scientific services and healthcare, and the least diverse workforces are in mining and agriculture. Workers born in Southern and Central Asia are notably overrepresented in the ICT sector in Australia, including in WA. In WA, migrants from these areas make up 5% of the workforce, but 11% of the ICT sector. Yet it's noted that WA has a small ICT sector compared to other states. For example, WA is home to 10% of the professional workforce in Australia, but just 6% of the ICT workforce. Shifting to the next slide, a relatively high proportion of Indigenous workers is also a feature of the Western Australian workforce. At 3% of the total workforce, WA has a higher share of workers who are Indigenous than New South Wales, Victoria or South Australia. However, participation in the workforce among Indigenous Australians in WA is low compared to other states and sits at just 47%, compared to say 67% in the ACT, 57% in Tasmania, 56% in Victoria, 55% in Queensland and 54% in New South Wales. As shown on this slide, Indigenous West Australians are also far more likely to be employed in the arts and cultural sector and are more likely to work in manufacturing and mining than non-Indigenous workers. This could potentially make Indigenous workers more susceptible to the impacts of the COVID-19 downturn, as well as technological change in the future. Looking at the next slide, Indigenous workers are also disadvantaged in regard to educational attainment and access to technology, with key issues driving the digital divide being affordability rather than ability. Just 14.5% of Indigenous workers in WA have a higher education qualification compared to 47% of the total workforce. So shifting to the next slide, in conclusion, identifying actions to ensure WA and Greater Perth have access to a sufficient pool of workers, and particularly adequate skilled workers, will be a key element of the research and consultation in the Future of Work project moving forward. Issues identified in this bulletin as requiring action include maximising labour force participation, particularly among females, reducing gender segregation by sector, and increasing industry and workplace diversity, increasing participation in STEM sectors, again, particularly among females, providing opportunities for workers to reskill or upskill, technology training, particularly for older workers, attracting skilled workers from overseas, enabling the emerging workforce, so the younger workforce, to develop appropriate future skills, researching and identifying policy responses to address underemployment and precarious work, and positive discrimination for Indigenous students and workers across sectors. Moving to the final slide, the next steps in this project will be to continue to compile baseline data regarding work in WA and Perth today, and to reach out to businesses and workers to understand the challenges they face adapting to technology, work and workforce changes, major global trends and challenges associated with COVID-19. An important part of this research will be future of work, business and community surveys, which will provide a more detailed understanding of the issues facing WA's industries and workers in adapting to change today. And the surveys are currently live. So thank you. I look forward to your questions and look forward to sharing more research results with you as they arise. Thanks, Marion.
Thank you for listening to Fact-Based Talks. Our research is available on our website to download free of charge, and you will find this bulletin and other bulletins related to the future of work and all other areas that the Committee for Perth covers on Perth and its future available there.